The date was May 10th, 1940, and Europe was on the brink of one of its most devastating conflicts in history. The French military, one of the largest and most powerful in the world, seemed like an unshakable force, positioned to hold off any invader. Their defenses were nearly impenetrable, or so they thought. The Maginot Line, a massive fortification system stretching from the Swiss border to Luxembourg, was built specifically to stop the Germans from invading again. It was considered the backbone of France's national security. With a well-equipped army and strategic fortresses in place, France's military leaders believed they had the situation under control. But within just a few short weeks, the unthinkable happened. The Nazi war machine, led by Adolf Hitler, tore through France like a hot knife through butter. The German forces, though smaller and less experienced in terms of defensive fortifications, executed a strategy so fast and relentless that it left the French military reeling. By June 14th, 1940, the Nazis were marching down the Champs-Élysées, and France was on the brink of collapse. The once mighty French military fell with astonishing speed. But how could this happen? Was it the invincibility of the Nazi Blitzkrieg? Or was there something much deeper, a fatal flaw in the French psyche and strategy that led to their rapid defeat? The truth is far more complicated and unsettling than many realize. France didn't just fall to the Germans. They were blindsided by a series of critical miscalculations, internal weaknesses, and a dangerous underestimation of the speed of modern warfare. And even more chilling, there were hints, whispers even, that the collapse might have been almost inevitable. This story is not just about tanks, guns, and generals. It's about the psychological and strategic failures that led to one of the most dramatic military collapses in modern history. But what if there were forces at play that no one could have predicted? Forces that were not just military, but deeply psychological and political, creeping through the French leadership and society long before the Germans even set foot on French soil? And so, we begin. How did this happen so quickly? And what role did France's internal disarray and false sense of security play in the catastrophic defeat that would change the course of history forever? Let's dive into the first part of this unraveling disaster. The Maginot Line. Imagine the French military with its proud history and formidable defenses relying on a massive concrete barrier to protect its borders. The Maginot Line, a series of fortifications stretching 280 miles from Switzerland to Luxembourg, was considered one of the most sophisticated defensive systems in the world. It was designed to withstand any German invasion, with bunkers, artillery, and underground tunnels, all heavily armed and strategically placed to block an attack. To the French, it was their safeguard, a guarantee that no army could break through without a long and bloody battle. But the Maginot Line had a fatal flaw, one that would doom France's defense before the first shots were even fired. The line stopped at the Ardennes forest, a rugged, hilly region that was considered impassable for large military forces. French military planners assumed no army would dare attempt to cross this dense, hilly terrain. They focused all their efforts on the fortified defenses, leaving the Ardennes wide open. When the German forces launched their attack on May 10th, 1940, they bypassed the Maginot Line completely, choosing instead to invade through Belgium. The French were caught off guard. While their forces were still positioned to fight a traditional battle on the Maginot Line, the Germans were already racing through the less defended Ardennes, using the fast-moving Blitzkrieg tactics that would soon become famous. The speed and precision of the German assault shocked the French. It was a completely new form of warfare, and the French, entrenched in their old ways, were unprepared for such an unconventional attack. The Maginot Line, which was meant to be a symbol of security, had become a trap, one that encouraged overconfidence and complacency. French leaders had placed too much trust in the static defenses of the line, believing that they could hold the Germans off long enough to win a war of attrition. But modern warfare was no longer about holding the line. It was about speed, coordination, and surprise. What's more unsettling is how the French military, despite having massive resources at their disposal, failed to adapt quickly to this new type of warfare. When they realized what was happening, it was already too late. The Germans had broken through the Ardennes and were advancing at lightning speed. The French could no longer mobilize their forces in time to stop the Blitz. The German advance was nothing short of extraordinary. In the first 5 days of their attack, the Germans covered 200 miles, leaving the French scrambling to respond. In contrast, the French forces were still stuck in a traditional mindset, with outdated tactics and a reliance on old-fashioned warfare. The rapid speed of the German forces, combined with their superior use of tanks and planes, allowed them to decimate the French defenses in a matter of days. But the Maginot Line wasn't the only mistake that contributed to France's sudden fall. There was another, force at play, something that went far beyond mere tactics and strategy. In the chaos of the early days of World War II, the French military had one significant advantage: size. They had a large, well-equipped army, fortified by the Maginot Line and supported by the conventional methods of trench warfare that had defined World War I. But against this heavy, static force, the Germans unleashed a new kind of warfare that would forever change military strategy: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The Blitzkrieg was a tactical revolution. Rather than relying on slow-moving infantry and static defenses, the Germans focused on speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. It was an entirely new approach that shocked the world. The Germans integrated tanks, aircraft, and infantry into fast-moving, highly coordinated strikes, breaking through enemy lines with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Tanks would spearhead the assault, followed closely by infantry to secure positions, and bombers would provide air superiority to neutralize defensive positions before the ground forces even arrived. The speed at which the Germans advanced left the French military scrambling. Where the French relied on slow-moving defensive strategies, the Germans adapted to the modern age. Their forces moved quickly, efficiently, and in surprising numbers. The rapid mobility of German panzer divisions, tanks that could move at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour, allowed them to outmaneuver the French. Unlike the French, who depended on predictable, slow movements, the Germans adapted their strategies on the fly, constantly keeping their enemies off balance and unprepared for what was coming next. French military commanders, still clinging to outdated tactics, underestimated the speed and intensity of the German onslaught. They thought that, like in previous wars, they could hold their ground and launch a counter-offensive once the initial wave of attack had been repelled. But the Germans had already advanced miles past the French defenses, making it almost impossible for the French to react in time. French forces, instead of countering an invasion, were left chasing shadows, trying to keep up with a war that was moving faster than they could adapt. In just the first week of the Blitzkrieg, German forces had pushed 100 miles into France, completely bypassing many of the French defenses. The Germans deployed more than 2,000 tanks in the initial attack, along with over 1,000 aircraft. In contrast, the French military had only about 400 tanks, many of which were outdated models. This staggering imbalance in both speed and firepower meant that the French stood no chance in matching the Germans' pace, and in just 3 weeks the Germans would capture Paris and render the French military forces all but defeated. The Blitzkrieg was more than just a military strategy. It was a psychological weapon. The speed and unpredictability of the German attack demoralized the French. French soldiers, who were used to traditional combat tactics, began to question whether they could even hold their ground. The Germans had disrupted their entire chain of command, leaving the French in disarray. While the Blitzkrieg tactic is often heralded as revolutionary, the idea itself wasn't entirely new. It drew from the successes of fast-moving cavalry units used in earlier wars. But what made Blitzkrieg so effective was the German ability to integrate tanks, planes, and infantry into a single coordinated force where each component relied on the others to maintain the momentum of the attack. This synergy made the Germans nearly unstoppable. As the Germans raced through France, it wasn't just their military might that helped secure their victory. It was also the internal chaos and disarray that crippled the French ability to respond effectively. As German forces advanced at lightning speed, it quickly became clear that the French military was struggling not just with the enemy, but with itself. While the Germans coordinated their attack with terrifying precision, the French army was bogged down by a lack of unity, indecision, and outdated strategies. It wasn't just that the French were unprepared for Blitzkrieg, it was that their leadership failed to adapt and effectively respond to the unfolding crisis. The French government and military leadership were divided, and this internal disarray undermined any chance of a cohesive defense. Politically, France was in turmoil. The country had just experienced the trauma of World War I, and the scars were still fresh. The horrors of the trenches had left many in the French government wary of another long, drawn-out conflict. Their fear of high casualties and a prolonged war led to a defensive mindset rather than one of decisive action. The government's hesitancy and indecisiveness were felt across the military command, where leaders disagreed on how to respond to the rapidly changing situation. Compounding the issue was a generational divide among French commanders. Many of the senior officers in the French military were still deeply entrenched in the tactics of World War I, defensive, static warfare. They were more focused on protecting entrenched positions than adapting to the fast-moving battlefield that Blitzkrieg demanded. In contrast, many younger officers saw the potential for innovation, but their voices were often drowned out by the senior leadership's refusal to break with tradition. The result was a deeply fragmented and confused military response. As German forces tore through France, French commanders were left scrambling, unsure of what to do next. With the German army moving so fast, communication lines were disrupted and orders were often delayed or misunderstood. In some areas, French forces retreated without a fight, while in others, they engaged in futile standoffs against overwhelming German forces. The French leadership's failure to adapt wasn't just a matter of indecision, it was a product of deeply ingrained military doctrine. The French had placed too much emphasis on static, defensive strategies like the Maginot Line, believing that they could hold their ground against an attacker. This belief was not entirely unfounded, as static defenses had worked in previous wars, but this mentality ignored the fact that warfare had dramatically evolved. The rapid pace and flexibility of the Blitzkrieg strategy were things that the French military was simply not prepared for. But the internal fractures in the French command weren't the only factors contributing to their downfall. As the military struggled to keep up, something else was at play: the toll of war on the morale of the French people and soldiers. As French soldiers and civilians watched the German forces sweep through their country, an invisible yet equally destructive force began to take its toll: morale. The rapid fall of France wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. And while France's soldiers had been trained for battle, they hadn't been prepared for the overwhelming fear and disillusionment that set in as the invasion unfolded. The French army, though large and well-equipped on paper, was not psychologically ready for the speed and brutality of the German Blitzkrieg. The sudden, relentless nature of the attack shattered the confidence of many soldiers who had grown accustomed to slower, more predictable warfare. This wasn't a traditional battle. There were no front lines to hold, no time to dig in and prepare. The Germans hit hard, fast, and without warning. It was a shock to the system, and it rattled the resolve of many. Moreover, the psychological trauma of World War I was still fresh in the minds of many French citizens and soldiers. The horrors of trench warfare, the staggering loss of life, and the lingering impact of the Great War had left France a nation in deep psychological scar tissue. When the German Blitzkrieg hit, it brought with it the fear that World War I would repeat itself, this time with even greater devastation. For many French soldiers, retreating felt like an inevitability, and some even abandoned their posts, driven by a sense of futility. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Civilians, too, were affected by this wave of fear and panic. As German forces advanced, civilians fled their homes in droves, adding to the chaos and disruption. The roads were clogged with refugees, creating a sense of helplessness and despair. Many began to believe that defeat was inevitable, and as the situation worsened, some even started questioning whether the government had betrayed them. The psychological toll of the Blitzkrieg was compounded by rumors and misinformation. As the Germans advanced, French soldiers and civilians alike were bombarded with whispers of surrender and defeat. These rumors, fueled by panic, created a sense of impending doom that spread faster than the German tanks themselves. The morale of the country plummeted, and this psychological warfare played just as significant a role in the collapse of France as the German military's physical assault. Some historians argue that France's defeat was not just the result of a military strategy failure, but an internal plan to surrender. Documents have emerged suggesting that key figures within the French government had already been contemplating surrender before the invasion even began. This theory suggests that French leadership may have, at the very least, allowed the collapse to happen because they believed it was the only way to save France from total annihilation. However, this claim remains highly debated as there is no conclusive proof of widespread treason, while there is no definitive evidence of a premeditated surrender. The emotional and psychological breakdown of the French population during the invasion undoubtedly contributed to the sense of inevitable collapse. The trauma of World War I, combined with the speed of the German advance, created an environment where fear and uncertainty took control of the national mindset. The scale of psychological damage during the invasion was staggering. More than 300,000 French civilians were displaced during the German advance, and an estimated 100,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, many of them suffering from mental exhaustion or breakdowns after days of retreating. These figures highlight the magnitude of the psychological toll that the invasion had on the nation. Entire towns were paralyzed by panic, and the strain on the French populace was immense. This fear spread like wildfire, weakening the resolve of both soldiers and civilians. But even as morale crumbled and the French military struggled to respond, another sinister force began to surface, a growing suspicion of betrayal from within. Was there a fifth column working in the shadows to bring about France's collapse? As the Nazi forces advanced deeper into France, an unsettling rumor began to circulate, whispers of betrayal from within. The idea of a fifth column, a group of traitors secretly working to undermine their own country, has haunted nations in times of war, and France was no exception. As the German army crushed the French defenses, there were growing suspicions that certain factions within France's own military and political establishment were aiding the enemy, either out of ideological alignment or sheer desperation. Could such a betrayal have contributed to the rapid fall of France in 1940? The concept of the fifth column was not new. It had been used in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, where internal collaborators worked to weaken the resistance from within. In France, the suspicion of traitors reached a fever pitch. The French military, already divided and disorganized, was rumored to have individuals who sympathized with the Nazi ideology or were looking for a way out of the war. These whispers of betrayal spread quickly through the ranks as soldiers questioned the loyalty of their commanders and political leaders. Could it be that France's downfall wasn't just the result of foreign invasion and poor leadership, but also of a hidden force working to ensure the country's collapse? One of the most infamous rumors to emerge during this time was that of General Philippe Pétain, the hero of World War I, who would later become the leader of the Vichy government. Some claimed that Pétain, in his reluctance to fight the Germans, may have been subtly influencing the military's decision to retreat or surrender. Others believed that certain high-ranking officers and politicians were secretly sympathetic to Nazi Germany, hoping that surrendering might ensure some form of cooperation or protection for France during the coming occupation. But beyond the military, there were also suspicions that parts of the French government were eager to make peace with the Nazis. The Vichy government, which would later collaborate with the Germans, did not come into power by accident. In the weeks leading up to the fall of France, there were increasing calls for negotiations with Germany, some of which were driven by high-ranking French officials. While many historians argue that these negotiations were born out of desperation and the hope of preserving French autonomy, others suggest that certain elements within the government saw this as a strategic retreat, positioning themselves to retain influence under Nazi control. There are even documents that suggest high-ranking officials in the French military may have shared crucial information with the Germans, such as troop movements and defensive positions. While this remains speculative, the speed at which the Germans moved through France, seemingly undeterred by the supposedly formidable French defenses, raised doubts. Had there been a deliberate undermining of French efforts from within? While the idea of widespread collaboration is highly debated, the French government's lack of coherent action and the rapid fall of key defensive positions suggest that there may have been failure of command and coordination rather than outright treason. The confusion among military leaders and the political discord in France undoubtedly created an environment in which collaboration seemed like a potential solution for some. However, the extent to which this collaboration actually occurred remains unclear, as there is no definitive evidence of a coordinated betrayal. The suspicions of betrayal were not limited to military leaders. A survey of French soldiers taken after the collapse showed that 30% of them believed there had been internal sabotage, while 40% claimed they were abandoned by their superiors. This level of distrust and confusion played a critical role in the disintegration of the French war effort, making the German advance almost unstoppable. The shadow of betrayal, whether real or imagined, created a debilitating atmosphere of paranoia and fear, undermining the morale and cohesion of the French forces. As the specter of internal treason loomed, the fall of France seemed almost inevitable. Yet there was another factor that played into this catastrophic collapse: the international balance of power and the brutal role that the Soviet Union's inaction would soon play. As the German forces advanced through France, the world watched with bated breath, waiting to see how the remaining global powers would respond. But one nation, in particular, remained curiously silent in the face of Nazi aggression: the Soviet Union. Despite being one of France's potential allies, the Soviets had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in August 1939, an agreement that stunned the international community and left France isolated. While the French military was scrambling to fend off the German onslaught, the Soviets remained neutral, leaving France to face the full force of the German Blitzkrieg alone. This non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had far-reaching implications, one of which was France's vulnerability. With the Soviets tied up with their own diplomatic maneuvering and unwilling to engage with the Nazis, France was left without an important potential ally. For France, this left them with no buffer on their eastern front, and their only hope was to rely on Britain, a fragile alliance at best. The Soviets had essentially removed themselves from the equation, and the French, already struggling, were now exposed on both sides. The French had hoped that Stalin would act as a deterrent to German aggression, possibly even opening a second front that would stretch Nazi forces thin. After all, in the years leading up to 1940, the Soviet Union had been preparing its own military, expanding its army, and stockpiling resources. But instead, Stalin chose to maintain peace with Hitler, effectively guaranteeing that France would be left to face the full brunt of the Nazi machine on its own. The Soviet Union's decision to remain neutral had a significant impact on the French military's strategy. In 1939, France and the Soviet Union had been in talks to form an alliance against Germany, but the pact between the Soviets and Nazis shattered those plans. By the time Germany invaded France, the French military was already stretched thin. The lack of Soviet support was evident in the numbers. 1.9 million French soldiers were captured by the Germans in the early stages of the invasion, many of whom were trapped without reinforcements or clear orders, creating a chaos that intensified with the absence of Soviet intervention. As German forces rolled through Belgium and France, the French military hoped for some form of Soviet intervention, but it never came. The impact of this betrayal, or perceived betrayal, by the Soviets was immense. While the Soviet Union continued to maintain its alliance with Nazi Germany, Britain was also left to carry the weight of France's defense. It soon became apparent that the French could not rely on Britain alone to turn the tide. What should have been a coalition of nations fighting against a common enemy turned into a series of isolated and disconnected efforts that proved ineffective against the full might of Nazi Germany. Stalin's motivations for signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were rooted in a desire for security. At the time, he believed that the Soviet Union needed time to build its military strength before engaging in any conflict with Nazi Germany. The pact essentially bought the Soviets time, giving them the space to prepare for an inevitable confrontation with Hitler. From Stalin's perspective, aligning with Germany in the short term made strategic sense, as it allowed the Soviet Union to focus on internal development without the distraction of war. For France, however, it was nothing less than a diplomatic betrayal that left them vulnerable to Germany's swift and brutal attack. As the Germans poured into Paris and France began to crumble, the hopes for a victory were dwindling. But amid the chaos and despair, a glimmer of resistance began to emerge, though it was far too little, far too late. As Nazi forces marched through France and the country crumbled, a small yet determined group of individuals began to rise up against the German invaders. They were the French resistance, an assortment of civilians, soldiers, and intellectuals who refused to accept the fate of their nation. Despite the overwhelming force of the German military and the rapid collapse of the French government, these resistance fighters engaged in acts of sabotage, espionage, and defiance, hoping to slow down the Nazi occupation and keep the flame of French independence alive. But while their courage was undeniable, the French resistance was tragically underpowered and poorly organized in the early days of the German invasion. The rapid pace of the Nazi advance left little time for coordinated action, and much of the resistance's early efforts were disjointed, uncoordinated, and ineffective. Most of the fighters were volunteers with limited military experience, armed with whatever they could scrounge together. They lacked the infrastructure, supplies, and support necessary to wage a meaningful resistance. Their early actions were heroic, but often came at great personal cost, with many operatives being captured, tortured, or killed by the Gestapo. Despite these challenges, the resistance proved to be a thorn in the side of the Nazi occupiers. They carried out acts of sabotage, like blowing up trains and bridges, derailing supply lines, and attacking German patrols. Some of these small victories, though they did not have a large-scale impact on the German war effort, were crucial in keeping the morale of the French people alive during the dark days of occupation. They also helped to disrupt German operations, forcing the Nazis to divert resources to counterinsurgency efforts. The resistance was not just about military action, it also took on an ideological role. In the face of Nazi propaganda and the growing collaboration of the Vichy government, the resistance stood as a beacon of hope for a free France. They spread anti-German leaflets, broadcasted messages of defiance over secret radio networks, and worked to maintain French culture and identity in a country now under foreign rule. In doing so, they managed to keep the spirit of resistance alive, even in the darkest of times. While the resistance's efforts were brave, their impact in the immediate aftermath of the invasion was limited. The lack of organization and resources meant that they were never in a position to truly challenge the Nazi occupiers. It wasn't until later in the war, particularly after the Allies invaded Normandy in 1944, that the French resistance grew in strength and coordination, eventually contributing significantly to the liberation of France. During the early stages of the war, however, they were fighting an uphill battle, with only small successes to show for their efforts. The early days of the French resistance were marked by significant personal sacrifice. It is estimated that over 100,000 French civilians were executed or sent to concentration camps by the Nazis for their involvement in resistance activities. Yet, despite the crushing losses, these acts of defiance continued. The resistance was responsible for disrupting more than 200 German military operations, and by 1944, it is estimated that over 500,000 French citizens were actively involved in underground movements. While the resistance could not prevent the fall of France in 1940, their efforts would later become a symbol of French resilience and determination. As the German occupation continued, they laid the groundwork for the eventual liberation of France, showing that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to fight for freedom never truly disappears. But as the resistance kept the fires of hope alive, France's most symbolic defeat was yet to come, the fall of Paris itself. The loss of the French capital marked not just a military defeat, but the collapse of the national spirit, one that would take years to rebuild. On June 14, 1940, the unthinkable happened. The German army entered Paris. The City of Lights, long a symbol of French culture, pride, and resistance, was now under Nazi control. The moment was not just a military loss. It was a psychological blow that shattered the heart of the French nation. Paris was not just a capital city. It was the very soul of France, a city that had witnessed centuries of triumph and tragedy. For the German forces, capturing Paris was a symbolic victory, one that represented the collapse of an entire nation. For the French, it was the ultimate humiliation. The French government, already in disarray, fled the city in panic. The president, Paul Reynaud, and key officials abandoned Paris, relocating to Bordeaux in the south. As German forces approached, the streets of Paris emptied, and Parisians braced for the inevitable occupation. The once grand boulevards, lined with history and culture, became a stage for a foreign army's victory march. Nazi soldiers paraded through the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing down the avenues that had long been a symbol of French elegance and resistance. The sight of German soldiers in the heart of Paris was a profound shock, not only to the people of France, but to the entire world. The French military, unable to halt the Nazi advance, was powerless to protect their capital. Paris, with its magnificent architecture and cultural heritage, fell almost without a fight. The city's famous landmarks, like the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, and the Arc de Triomphe, stood silent witnesses to the destruction of a nation's pride. But what made the fall of Paris even more symbolic was the sheer speed with which it happened. In just 6 weeks, the German army had bypassed France's formidable defenses and captured its capital. The French, once thought to be a strong military power, had crumbled under the weight of an overwhelming, fast-moving force. The image of Nazi soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées, once a symbol of freedom, now stood as a stark reminder of the collapse of an empire that had been one of the leading powers in Europe for centuries. The collapse of Paris was marked by shocking statistics. In the first month of the German invasion, 1.9 million French soldiers were captured and over 300,000 civilians fled Paris, creating an exodus of catastrophic proportions. The Germans took over 3,000 French towns in just 6 weeks, and nearly 500,000 refugees flooded the southern regions of France. The speed and scale of the collapse were unprecedented, leaving a nation stunned and broken. For the Germans, Paris was a symbol of conquest, and the psychological victory was almost as important as the military one. Paris, a beacon of freedom, had fallen. The Nazis had not only defeated the French military, they had crushed the very spirit of the nation. This moment would become one of the most iconic images of World War II, the fall of a capital city, a symbol of defiance, and the loss of national identity. The fall of Paris, while devastating, was not entirely unexpected. By the time German forces reached the capital, the French government had already evacuated, and the French military was in disarray. The German strategy of Blitzkrieg had overwhelmed the French forces, and the defense of Paris as a symbolic stronghold was no longer feasible. The Germans, knowing the psychological importance of the city, ensured their capture of Paris was swift and absolute, sending a message to the world that France had fallen. The fall of Paris was the turning point, the final act in a tragic drama. But the story of France's defeat didn't end there. It was only just beginning, and the repercussions of this loss would echo throughout the war, shaping the future of the nation for years to come. The rapid fall of France in 1940 left scars that would take decades to heal. In the span of a few short weeks, the world watched as one of Europe's greatest military powers collapsed under the weight of a well-coordinated Nazi assault. The shock was not only in the speed of France's defeat, but in the sheer scale of its psychological and national collapse. France had long been regarded as a symbol of strength and pride in Europe, but in 1940 it seemed as though the very core of the nation had been shattered. After the fall of Paris, France was divided into 2 zones, the German-occupied North and the Vichy regime-controlled South, a puppet government that collaborated with the Nazis. The Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, offered little resistance to the German occupiers and made compromises that would haunt France for years to come. The collaboration with Nazi forces, both in terms of military and ideological support, left a bitter legacy. The Vichy regime would become a symbol of France's collaboration with the enemy, and many of those who supported or worked within it would later be held accountable for their actions after the war. The French resistance, though small and fragmented at first, became an enduring symbol of French resilience. Over time, it grew in strength, particularly after the D-Day landings in 1944, when the Allied forces invaded Normandy and began liberating France from Nazi control. The resistance played a key role in sabotaging German operations, gathering intelligence, and maintaining hope among the French people during the darkest days of occupation. Though their impact in 1940 was limited, their actions in the years to come were essential in the eventual liberation of the country. For France, the defeat of 1940 represented more than just the loss of a battle. It was the loss of national pride and the collapse of a military institution that had once been one of the most formidable in Europe. The French people had to rebuild from the ground up, not just militarily, but socially and psychologically. The war left the country divided, distrustful, and weakened, but also determined to recover. The psychological scars left by the fall of France are still felt today. The trauma of defeat, the question of collaboration, and the struggle to regain national pride shaped post-war French politics, culture, and identity. For years after the war, the question of why France fell so quickly in 1940 lingered in the national consciousness, debated by historians, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. Was the fall of France in 1940 truly inevitable, shaped by a series of military miscalculations, psychological breakdowns, and internal betrayals? Or could the French have held their ground and turned the tide had they made different choices? The answer is still debated, but one thing is certain: France's defeat in 1940 left an indelible mark on the course of history. The defeat was not just a military failure, but a moment that redefined the future of France and Europe for decades to come. The lessons learned from this stunning collapse would serve as a reminder of the fragility of nations and the unpredictable nature of war.